course, that the new GM model is going to bring new risks, and how can those risks be mitigated, and how can those risks be dealt with? And we're going to be turning here to Anvil, who, of course, well versed in this sort of thing, risk management and so on, and compliance and those sort of things. And Matthew Judge, I can see, and we're also expecting Matthew Judge is the managing director of Anvil Group, and we're expecting Nicola Elcock as well. Can't see her at the moment, Matthew, so I'm going to rely on you to kick off with this.
What I'm going to do is I'm not going to flick through a number of slides. We're just going to keep this infographic up on the screen, really, and I'll discuss certain points around it. So hopefully you are able to all see it. Essentially, it is a infographic referring to a 12-step process to return to international assignment or travel, as we framed it. And essentially, it's just a cue card, if you like, to from which people can consider key elements of things that they should think about and assess prior to assignments or trips actually starting, and some of the steps at the end there around what to do when the assignment or trip has already started. So I'll focus mainly on a few elements here at the front end, and it's been interesting listening to some of the breakout session results and the discussion so far, as we're going to touch on a number of those points. So it's also, I need to caveat that this has been done on the basis of the fact that the organisation has actually decided to return to work or to return to travel in some way, shape or form. And this can be used as part of the process for enabling those assignments to resume, or for trips, short-term assignments and trips to actually start. But it will formulate the due diligence process of which you as individuals can use to raise as discussion points across the wider community or stakeholder team that's involved in the process. The number one is assessing physical and mental health of the employees. So there's a great deal of focus around physical health, but one element that seems to be being forgotten about following the COVID situation is people's mental health and well-being. And organisations do need to take stock and understand the mental resilience and well-being resilience of individuals before they're actually put back out on assignment outside of their home country. If it's resuming an assignment and somewhere they're familiar with and been to before, then the anxieties and stresses perhaps might not be so great. But obviously, if it's a new assignment or a new requirement of a trip abroad, it still may cause some anxiety. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that prior to lockdown, people would have been aware of their own general physical health and well-being, but lockdown does very strange things to different people, and obviously we've all been on our own journey throughout this period and may have been exposed to other symptomatic issues that can occur, such as the bereavement of loved ones, close family, friends. We may have developed or re-experienced some symptomatic issues of prior mental health issues, should we have had them before, which can also cause issues. And of course, on the physical health side of things, we may have had existing medical conditions that unfortunately haven't been able to be treated correctly during lockdown, because the health services of our respective countries have been operating in the same way as they were prior to the lockdown, because they've been dealing with COVID. And that can fall all the way down to some of the lowest sort of common day-to-day issues, such as dental issues and things like that, that have been left untreated, which individuals now need to get dealt with. So assessing the resiliency of individuals to be able to go back onto assignment and business trips and short-term assignments, I think is a key element of assessing whether individuals are fit to go back to work, essentially. And I think going through some sort of assessment process with your occupational health teams and asking them to become involved prior to assignments taking place again, I think would be a fundamental part of your risk assessment before assuming and resuming travel. We all now know that illnesses caused within the workplace, or COVID illnesses now caught within the workplace, are issues that are reportable under the RIDOR legislative areas of the Health and Safety at Work Act within Europe, and there will be other labour legislation in other countries that will need to be considered. And therefore, from a duty of care and a risk management perspective, it will be very pertinent of organisations to take steps to ensure that they have this area covered and that they have tried to assess it in some way, shape or form before just automatically posting people back on assignments. You may also find as well, it becomes part of the immigration work permit or visa process as well, because where a number of work permits or visas were revoked as part of certain countries' lockdown procedures, therefore those visas and work permits will need to be reapplied for, and therefore health assessments as well as antibody testing and antigen testing for COVID will be part of those processes by those respective governments. I think the actual monitoring of quarantine controls in different jurisdictions is obviously going to be a big challenge, as they seem to be changing on a daily and hourly basis with certain countries. I think obviously in Europe we're now starting to hear more about the plans for opening up certain air corridors that are tested, which will allow us to start moving again more freely across Europe. Obviously, the EU has now brought out some governments and direction around that, whereas previously a lot of the individual European member states had obviously made up their own rules without consulting with the broader EU environment. And of course, I know as global mobility specialists, you're probably all worried about the posted workers directives, which are obviously now going to be a concern for individuals as they start to move through this period. So understanding the quarantine restrictions upon arrival in certain countries and which countries are available to travel and move back to are key. I think people will need to be aware that there will be quarantine controls when arriving in different countries, but it's also important to understand where that initial quarantine will need to take place. A lot of people are assuming that they'll be able to land in an aeroplane and travel freely back to the city where they were based before, or they're now going to be posted. But actually, a lot of the quarantine needs to take place in the city where the airport is located for up to 14 days. So that means they will have to stay in temporary accommodation in the city where the airport they've landed in is based, and they need to be aware of what those quarantine controls are. We've heard of some clients that have experienced issues because employees have landed in certain countries. They're going to respect the quarantine control, but they thought they'd pop to a restaurant and get their favourite meal before going to their accommodation, taking a selfie and announcing to everybody on social media they're back, and that being picked up by the authorities, and therefore they've been imprisoned for 14 days or several weeks for being in breach of quarantine controls and restrictions. I think you also need to understand as well the requirements for the track and trace applications that different governments have also put into place for certain jurisdictions, and whether your IT security controls and cyber controls will allow some of those applications to be installed. Obviously, it will be imperative and necessary for assignments when they resume in certain countries to adapt to those controls and protocols, but you'll need to be sure that those applications can be downloaded and supported on company devices. And we are aware of issues, especially where people are travelling as a family, where perhaps the children haven't had it installed on their telephones before resuming going back to school, and therefore that's caused particular issues and legal challenges in those areas. So it is a moving feast, and it is something that can be monitored, though, some of these controls and challenges. And I'd encourage you to work with your third-party supplier base and your supply chain to understand who might be able to best assist you with maintaining and understanding those controls, because a number of the technical partners, including ourselves and others, have got mechanisms now for assisting you with that process. It's also worth pointing out that there has been changes now in insurance policies, mainly around things like traditional policies like business interruption insurance, but it does also impact elements like employers' liability insurance, where COVID as an issue has been part of insurance or covered as in a communicable disease in previous policies. New policies aren't tending to cover that, and therefore you would need to be aware of any changes in that in those insurance policies that may impact you. Luckily, I don't believe most private medical insurance has changed since COVID, and therefore that coverage does maintain. And we have heard of additional insurance policies being launched to provide additional benefits and cover specifically for COVID-related illnesses. But it will be something your assignees will be concerned about should they return to their assignment destinations. What if I was to contract COVID at a later stage, and how will that impact me, and how will the organisation be able to assist me during this time? And all of that leads into conducting risk assessments on the destination countries and cities to be visited. A lot of people tend to look at these risk assessments as on a country as a whole, but it does need to come down to individual cities of location sometimes, because different cities, even for example across China, will have different controls in place. And we've even seen in the UK that we're getting these lockdown bubbles starting to appear, and most recently that's occurred in Leicester. But we already now see that London is looking at how the implications of the city lockdown in Leicester is going to impact the controls and the processes and the procedures for how London would react, and what information data sources from which public authorities they will need to levy and understand to trigger those processes. So I think what we're also saying there is a risk within countries from simply travelling from one city to another domestically, and therefore that should be understood if there are additional requirements and any additional testing that may be undertaken at those particular stages. I believe we've probably be aware from the press releases that one of the airlines out in Dubai was even imposing their own tests at people at the airport before they were able to get onto the plane. Unfortunately, they were the finger prick style tests, which have since proven to be wholly unreliable. But nonetheless, it's something that people need to be aware of as part of the journey of returning on their assignment, or when they're on assignment and moving around these countries that they may be exposed to. So I think I heard somebody mention earlier as part of the discussion that this is also an ideal time to learn from some of the previous lessons that we may have experienced when moving into lockdown about the repatriation and the communications that need to take place with our assignees and employees at different times. And it's an ideal time now to really look at your medical emergency response plans for receiving treatment in particular countries, because the health landscape has changed, and some of those facilities that we were able to access before may no longer be available to treat families in those particular locations, or they may be still operating on a reduced range of services, and therefore not all situations or medical issues will be able to be treated. So I think that the main area there is about re-looking at your business continuity plans, looking at your evacuation planning and engaging with the security teams of your organisations or the risk teams to understand what could be put into place and done differently, because I think we've all experienced trying to repatriate individuals from those countries at this during that particular time was incredibly difficult. The cost of charter aircraft went through the roof. The route options weren't available and open to us in the same way before. And one of the main suggestions I would make is look to establish evacuation points within the same country to secure safety where possible and avoid those particular situations.
Okay.
But the main message is it's not just a problem for mobility, it is a wider organisational issue, and it's a great opportunity for the mobility teams to now have a stronger voice and lead the charge in bringing a lot of these disparate stakeholders together to ensure that you all have a proper plan so that you can re-engage with assignments and travel properly and effectively without causing anxiety and fear to the employee base.